And now Colin Peacock from the capital, Wellington, with Midweek Mediawatch. G'day, Colin.
G'day, Mark.
Welcome along.
Thanks so much.
First up, a delicate subject, this, isn't it? The coverage of a very distressing trial underway in Christchurch.
Yeah, so this is the trial of Lauren Dickerson, on trial for killing her 3 children in Timaru shortly after the whole family emigrated from South Africa, the defence being incapacity due to insanity. So this is something I'm sure anyone who's been looking at the news this week will have found hard to avoid. So a lot of attention on the trial. It's going to last for 3 weeks, so we're going to have to get used to it. And of course, the death of children in these circumstances is as serious as anything can be. You know, there is understandably high public interest in this trial, but the intensity and the prominence of the coverage is prompting some people to push back.
Yeah, and, you know, the coverage, has it really been appropriate, with I guess, the appropriate health warnings about the distressing nature of this subject?
Yeah, I think the media aren't doing anything that they ought not to be doing. It is critical, of course, a basic principle really that people don't get ambushed by stuff that is seriously distressing and the sort of details that will really upset people. So the mainstream media have been doing that, prior warnings of the upsetting nature of the content to come, and running things like sources of support, helpline numbers and so on for those who do find that it brings up issues for them. And that's all, you know, best practice, or in fact standard practice really, for coverage that involves images or descriptions, situations that are genuinely upsetting. But just as one example of some of the pushback on social media, this medical professional and media commentator Dr. Emma Wehipehana on social media said, look, she thinks there's a gratuitous amount of detail being shared in these reports about this particularly tragic case, and links to health helplines don't, she believes, offset the macabre and self-serving effect, in her words, of breathlessly reporting the gruesome details. Another one was David Farrier on his blog Webworm, where he does commentary as well as a bit of investigative journalism. He was saying about this and other cases, because it's not the only one in the news right now. He's saying, I'm not sure my brain or anyone else's really needs to know this level of detail. And in his mind, it shows what he describes as an utter disregard for the life that's been taken.
Yeah, he refers to it as torture porn, which is an interesting way. But I think they've got a point. Do you feel they have a point in this criticism?
Partly, but I mean, the online sites, if we take the so-called big two, the Herald and stuff.co.nz that specialise in breaking news, they are writing a lot of stuff from the evidence being presented in court. Stuff even has a live blog that's been running since the start of the trial, reporting the evidence almost as soon as it's presented in court. I do wonder, what is the appetite for that? How many people out there really want to know that stuff straight away? However, their live blog is top of their list on the website of most viewed stories, so people clearly are tuning into it. But, you know, personally, I can wait to the end of the day for a summary written by a reporter, or at least the end of a court session for that sort of information. Also, that live blog has been at points studded with family, personal pictures. These aren't images that haven't been shown in the media before when this case has been in the news, but that does feel unnecessary. To me, the Herald, for example, had a kind of prepped montage of today of Lauren Dickerson in the dock, and then sort of superimposed in the same image, you know, personal baby photos of the 3 children. You know, that's the creating an image to try and, you know, dress up the page. That to me feels, I'll just say, unnecessary. And interestingly, the Herald's social media team posted this note today. They said, Justice Cameron Manda has directed the media not to invite comment in relation to media articles during the trial, and therefore, at the request of the judge, we will continue suspending comments where applicable. So I'm sort of struggling to think of the circumstances where, you know, public comments on those articles will ever actually be really helpful.
Of course, the other side of this is that justice must be seen to be done, and responsible media shouldn't shy away from covering these really distressing cases.
Yeah, and that is also true. I mean, some essential journalism does harm, does upset people, but, you know, can be important for that very reason. For example, if you think of coroner's inquiries and inquests, media coverage of the evidence does reveal important things that people really need to know. In this case, even at early stages, people consuming the coverage, might be hearing about warning signs of people in distress, the psychological problems of resettling in another country and so on. That may be relevant further down the track. And, if a thing goes through a full inquest situation, you find out about prevention, accountability, those sorts of things. However, David Farrier, as you mentioned it in that article, he drew attention to another one that this case made me think of, the so-called Mangere torture trial. This is the 17-year-old Demetrius Pairama. Horrible death. 2 people have already been convicted for her horrible murder. Another 16-year-old is now on trial with their involvement, that aspect of it. So that case is back again. It's wretched. And reading those reports, I remember when of the first trial and the convictions, just awful stuff. To read that again, but I do feel for the reporters who are doing this, because you do need to know if such things are happening, why, the circumstances that so-called friends, acquaintances could operate in the so-called empathy-free way. So it's something we don't want to think about happening in our society, but it is, and documenting it when it's in court is something. But as David Farrier of Webworm put it, he said when people he knows who have challenged this, because it's said in court, is it fine to say it everywhere? Should the media publish it all? He clearly feels not. But when reporters have pushed back when challenged and said, look, we're not going to withhold what's going on in open court, that's, and of course readers don't need to read it, and they've been warned if it's going to be distressing. So I guess, that's the balance of it. But it is a difficult one, and it does make you wonder about that appetite for all the worst details of what gets said in court.
But it's quite a sign, isn't it, when that particular live blog is top of the charts, if you like, in the Stuff website. Yeah,
I wonder if it will be in 3 weeks' time, yes, though. But I guess if they get closer to the end of the trial, then it probably would pick up again. But there is an element of macabre interest, I think, in there for sure.
Now, for years, the crimes of arts patron Sir James Wallace were, kept secret, effectively, and now his name is out, and the media, they're not holding back, they're catching up.
No, and remember Sir James did go all the way to the Supreme Court to try and keep his name suppressed. So, yes, the media are indeed catching up. So we spoke on Mediawatch to RNZ's own arts expert Mark Amery about this, and he said at the time, there would be questions that both the media and the arts scene would have to confront about, biting the hand that feeds, because, he was a source of patronage and funds for so many projects and so many people. Those questions are now being raised in the media. Mark also said at the time, he was one of those people, as we know from the reports, that Sir James Wallace was asking for letters of support from after he'd been found guilty, but before the sentencing.
Well, he was far from the only one approached, though.
Yeah, and this we know from the Herald on Sunday 2 weekends ago, the Sunday before last, they reported 89 people had actually written and responded to that request with letters of reference. The paper named some of them who were better known, some of whom who had, the paper noted, benefited directly from his support. Just to pick one, Rena Owen, the actress, had praised Wallace's support for the arts, described him as an old-school gentleman, beloved elder, and none of those, it seems, were prepared to talk to the paper about quite why they'd supported him, in the knowledge that he'd been found guilty of something, even if they didn't know the details. But again, David Farrier on that Webworm blog of his wrote about this as well, because he too was one of the people who received this letter, and he made the point that a lot of these letters of support that are now being made public, they often raised the money. He was funding so many people. He believes many of them just probably felt too indebted to him or too conflicted to speak up. And he published the entire letter that he received and blocked out the sort of CC names of all the other people. But interesting to read the full text of it and just to make it public in that way.
Mm-hmm. So the victims of Wallace, been speaking to the media. I saw the Sunday program that featured one of them.
Yeah, that's right. Dunedin Identity Dudley Benson spoke to Stuff and to TVNZ's Sunday show.
It's time to shine a light on what he did to our people.
Sir James Wallace, finally revealed.
This guy would do whatever he wanted. It was terrifying.
I think he is an entitled individual.
A survivor speaks out.
No one did anything to stop any of this.
So it sounds like a bit of a tough watch. It was quite fascinating, though, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. I mean, it was difficult to watch, but also I think a sense of satisfaction for the victims and the supporters. Dudley Benson talked about being at Wallace's first trial that got derailed. It also featured the Sunday show theatre director James Wenley urging others to come forward and talk about it and for a full accounting of wrongdoing to go on. In the Herald on Sunday, they followed up last weekend with former Chief Executive of the Broadcasting Standards Authority, now an author, Dominic Sheehan, also talking about, he's a lawyer as well by training, so he had some interesting insights into the whole taking part in the trial process. So it seems like there was some satisfaction for them having gone through the process. Now things are out in the open. So, a little more of a more satisfactory experience than perhaps the Dickerson trial and that sort of work in progress and, the more upsetting details of those dripping out in court in the way they are.
Now, lately on Midweek Mediawatch, you've been updating us on personnel changes at Stuff. Most of them behind the scenes in management and editorial comings and goings, etc. But today they announced some new on-air talent. Yes,
they have appointed Tova O'Brien, the former News Hub political editor and former morning host at the now defunct Today FM, as their chief political correspondent.
She was last on air, remember it well, leading that notorious on-air revolt against the bosses when they closed down Today FM. Is this an appointment made with perhaps the election in mind?
Yes, I think so. I mean, people said at the time, well, that'll be a bit of a miss for the election because, she would have been in her element doing that. Indeed, the Stuff statement doesn't say a whole lot about what they plan for her, but it does say she will shine a light on political, economic policy issues that impact everyday Kiwis. This is particularly important given it is election year, so they clearly want her input on that. And she herself in the statement said, I've been missing journalism and politics so much. Can't wait to get cracking into an already banger election campaign, she says. So 3 months to go, but she still clearly thinks it's on already and she wants to be in amongst it.
So she's a broadcaster, of course, and Stuff is historically a newspaper or news publisher. Is this a sign of a new direction, perhaps, for Stuff, the way the company's moving?
Yes, and we can see that in some of these editorial changes that we've been talking about in bits and pieces over recent weeks. First with that change at the top with the chief executive, Sinead Boucher, who's the owner of the company, devolving her management responsibilities, becoming chief publisher and so on. So Tova O'Brien's announcement was made by the managing director of Stuff Digital, Nadia Tolich, herself a former broadcaster brought in from ZB. So yeah, it's clearly a move away from that newspaper and news publishing legacy of the company. Meanwhile, other whispers about long-standing editors, or in fact, one at Stuff himself, Mark Stevens, who's been there, I think, for more than 25 years, reports that he might be leaving the company, although none of that absolutely confirmed. I've asked about it at the moment, but also NZME's Miriana Alexander, senior editor at the Herald. She's taking a break now, and next week is the last one for RNZ's own head of news, Richard Sutherland. So, a bit of a thinning out of senior editorial news ranks at different media companies around the country.
Well, Colin, we've had a reaction from text, no name attached. The media's job is to report on the facts, not to censor them. The consumer should be left to make up their own mind about what is suitable for their personal consumption.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and that's why the warnings are there. This was stuff reported in open court, and justice must be seen to be done. All of that is true. I guess the point that David Farrier was making, he said, coming back from the United States, which is extremely open and free media, he had the feeling, perhaps in those and other countries, that there wasn't the willingness, because of course the media never put absolutely every detail out there. But also I think the thing that's winding a few people up the wrong way is that is described as breathless. I don't know if that's the right word, but that almost instant reporting of detail, things that sound like private medical information. Of course, it's being out in court, but the Lauren Dickinson's IVF history and so on, all of that, to hear about that online mere minutes or less than that even after it's been read out in court is what's, I think, upsetting some people.
Yeah, it was witnessed as well with the Grace Millane trial, wasn't it? The detail that came out there where she, the victim, was, almost became a victim.
Yes, absolutely. That's very much the same feeling there.
Now, a story that was big news late last week, Chris Hipkins ruling out any new wealth tax, including the capital gains tax that Labour Party has proposed in the past, but always backed away from.
Yes, and once again, it seems so. A big reaction to that, predictably perhaps, seems to be the third rail of New Zealand politics. So just back in April, TVNZ's political editor Jessica Mackay said, look, Hipkins seems to have made a calculated decision to not play the rule-in, rule-out game following perhaps Jacinda Ardern's lead. But then he followed her lead in saying, OK, I do rule it out. So, she noted that from overseas where he was at the time, I think in Lithuania when he announced it, saying that, OK, now he's made that call for purely electoral reasons. And reflecting on that last Sunday in the Sunday Star Times, Andrea Vance in her weekly column says, look, this is a pure electoral calculation, cynicism underlined by the fact the finance minister was working on plans for a wealth or capital gains tax and had been for months. Labor's now trapped in a comfort zone of low taxation. Hipkins has looked at it, say swing voters won't tolerate it, but absolutely discussing it as a move relating to the next election. But not everyone quite saw it that way. So Jack Tame, who has a Saturday show on News Talk ZB, he had a different view about this, thought it was a wider leadership issue on Saturday.
If you're only prepared to make popular decisions as a leader, though, then what is the point of leadership? It's not really leadership, is it? It's just focus grouping. It's just polling. Instead of laying out a platform, debating its merits and pursuing a really distinct vision, you might as well just have, I don't know, like a smartphone app or a website on which everyone votes for every little policy so that you can be sure you never fall afoul of the masses. I'm not remotely surprised by Chris Hipkins' captain's call on tax reform this week.
Yeah, well, it's not a bad. You could have instant referenda, do you reckon?
Yeah, well, this isn't a point that other people haven't made. But look, I would like to see in comments like that some acknowledgement that the media are part of this, that make it harder for leaders to do these bold ideas and these potentially unpopular things. One case in point, on that very network, News Talk ZB, the Jack Tame's own fellow hosts, when the capital gains tax was raised, hammering the so-called politics of envy. There was very uniform kind of attitude among their hosts who have, the privilege of an editorial opinion or pulpit on the air. So, the fact that there is almost a chorus like that, if I were a politician who was minded to make some bold and unpopular calls and take a risk, it would be galling, I think, to hear that. It comes at a cost, and the media, I think, does increase the risk for politicians that want to do that these days.
Mm-hmm. Anyone reflecting on that at this point?
Bernard Hickey, who's addressed this issue of wealth taxes because he writes about political economy and, the overbalance and dependence on property and so on, and unbalanced investment in this country. He believes it'll now be impossible for any kind of wealth tax to be implemented within the next decade or two, with the two major parties seeming to hold the same position. But he said in a conversation with the political writer and thinker Daniel McLaughlin, he said what seems to be happening in other places in the Western world as well, where in modern politics, it's defence is becoming stronger than offence. You want to propose a change, you want to do it. There are now so many roadblocks, lobby groups, opposition. And I think the media is a part of that sort of matrix.
One of Bernard Hickey's slogans, though, is when the facts change. He can't see the future and how circumstances might change to force the issue. Is that a bit bleak?
Yeah, I thought it was a bit of a contradiction at first. That's the name of the podcast, or one of the podcasts that he does, When the Facts Change. But Bernard kind of addressed this himself. He said, look, I'm not being nihilistic. I think it's a clear-eyed way of doing it, just to look at the problem. This is frozen. You won't be able to change the tax system in this way with this political consensus. He said, I now want to focus on as much as I can on the range of solutions and issues that might exist outside of the usual debates in official circles and political parties, But what he fears is, in terms of the media, is that if the politicians like Chris Hipkins just rule it out, that means the media will just stop asking questions about the idea at all. No point in asking even a minor party, do you back this change? Because, if the senior politicians are saying, nah, we've ruled it out, then, it just becomes something that in the media's mind will never happen and won't get discussed.
So why does he think that, do you think?
he says, I've got this privilege, me, Bernard Hickey, because I've got my own media outlet now, my subscriber-funded newsletter, the Kaka, do my own podcast. He said, I can do this because I own a home. I've got, some untaxed capital gains from owning homes over the years. I've got this lovely position as a sort of self-employed journalist. But he says he believes the main papers rely so heavily on real estate and the banking industries for their advertising revenues that it makes it hard for them to support those discussions. He said RNZ is big enough to be able to report on the issue with clarity, he says, but he's warning that if we get a more conservative type of government, as we've seen in other countries like the UK, Australia, their public broadcasters and publicly funded ones have, come under pressure. So he's got a fairly bleak assessment of the media's ability to imagine or promote debate about anything other than the kind of political orthodox status quo in terms of major questions of, the economy.
Well, that won't be very popular elsewhere in the media. Has any of the media responded to that so far?
Not so many, but one who I thought made a good point, Janae Tibshraeny, she's the Wellington business editor of the Herald. She hit back at him on social media, effectively saying, look, I've worked for New Zealand media that's been reliant on advertising, at the Herald currently, previously at interest.co.nz, where there is challenging and thoughtful writing on economic matters. She said, I've never felt compelled to report in accordance with any advertiser's interest, and editorial decisions to be, kept pretty separate. So she doesn't see that same sort of horizon. And of course, there are, even for, like her colleague at the Herald, Liam Dan, for example, the head of business, he writes about wide horizons and, matters of national importance. So, I think Bernard might be overstating that, but you just certainly sense his frustration because he's written about these issues for so long that having it kind of closed off politically by all the major players is, it's clearly frustrating for him.
Any idea what might improve things?
Well, on his site, the Kaka, and the podcaster that he does with some of his fellows, he did share his view about this sort of frozen state of the economy. He did an interview with the listener columnist Daniel McLaughlin that I mentioned earlier, and Daniel said, look, it seems interestingly like the ideological debates these days aren't happening between the parties, left, right, National Labour, whatever, left bloc, right bloc. He says this is more like they're happening within them. Maybe that's not that profound a statement, but, those who might want redistribution of income or taking risks, within the parties is where those debates are going on. And when Daniel McLaughlin said, look, I think the media are actually doing a reasonable job reporting things like the importance of this wealth tax veto, if you like, they raised this, or Bernard did, with this notion of solutions journalism, actually trying to think outside the box and reporting on the consequences of political decisions that are made and the ones that aren't made. And he brought it up this way in a discussion with his friend and colleague, editor Peter Bale, in their weekly online chat they call the Hoon.
Rather than bang on about the problems all the time, which I'm quite good at doing, or worrying too much about who won and who lost and, the burps and the farts of any sort of election campaign, to actually focus on coming up with solutions that may not be emerging from the political environment, but have come from overseas or from people in NGOs and the likes, and try and bring those up.
I quite like that concept of just, the burps and farts and noise of an election campaign obscuring the big issues. But I applaud him for raising it. And, it's, some will see it as an airy-fairy concept, the solutions journalism. But if, we're thinking about that notion of thinking about the consequences of political decisions made and not made, I think is a good one.
We've got about 2.5 minutes, Colin, so we might as well try and get a little bit in about the Hugh Edwards story. Of course, last week when I spoke to Hayden, we didn't know who this BBC presenter in the UK alleged to have paid a young person for explicit images was. The name came out shortly after, but those shockwaves still being felt.
Yeah, that's right. So hours after you spoke to Hayden, Hugh Edwards' wife, who's also a TV producer of note at another broadcaster, said, yes, indeed it was her husband. Of course, he's huge in the UK and not so well known until now. But, the problem is, as Hayden mentioned, the lawyer for the young person concerned said the story was rubbish. It was published by the tabloid The Sun. And when TVNZ's Breakfast Show were catching up with this, they didn't quite get it right on this interview on Thursday last week.
We saw some coverage from the BBC, but have we had any response from the BBC about Hugh Edwards' resignation, and or where is that Met Office investigation at?
So it is, of course, the Metropolitan Police, the Met, that are investigating, not the Met Office, which is the UK's version of Met Service. Sorry to pick on them for that.
But that story has been complicated by the BBC because it started its own investigation.
It did. That's the extraordinary thing. So while the Sun said, OK, Hugh Edwards is in hospital, this is a serious thing, we'll stop reporting on this now, and they'll wait and see how this is investigated by the BBC itself. At that point, the BBC's own news programme Newsnight said, look, they've been investigating other questionable conduct of Hugh Edwards, text messages sent to colleagues and so on. Now, that's amazed some BBC News people who are saying, look, basically those are kind of HR matters. It doesn't sound great, but this is not, it's only because he's well known, and this is really something that should be dealt with internally. It's not something that should be blasted, across, news bulletins at that point when, clearly the situation was serious because of other claims.
So, well, that's just about all we have for time for you this week, Colin, and appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to you Sunday morning. And you've got a big show planned for that, presumably?
Yeah, absolutely. There's plenty more. That Hugh Edwards story will be rolling on, and tons of other issues as well. So we are certainly not short of stuff to report on Sunday, and indeed I won't be the next time I talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Good on you, mate. Well, thanks so much. Colin Peacock there with our Midweek Media Watch.